As you know, Chris was our town crier for many years and he does a fantastic job, very audible. It's my very great pleasure to introduce one of our newest colleagues, I think our newest colleague, Michael Zellmann Rhorer. Those of you who were here last year would have seen him on Zoom from Berlin, but I'd like to say that it's a most wonderful appointment. We're very grateful to have him. I'll tell you a bit about him in a minute, but also I'd like you and all SEC members to know that you have actually contributed somewhat to bringing him here. So many thanks, all of you, and keep it up because we want to hang on to him. Now, Michael is, of course, spectacularly well qualified to speak to us on anything to do with papyrology, but it's only one of his interests. And we're interested to know he's got degrees from Berkeley and Harvard. He's worked on a postdoc project, which is very dear to my heart and obviously to his, in Oxford. And most recently, he's been a postdoc in Berlin on the Zodiac project. But now he's with us working on our Christian papyri project, and we'd like to give him a very warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Alana. That's extremely kind of you, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here in person with you all this time. So, taking my cue from the kind invitation of Alana, I will take as my point of departure the well-known double name of Paul. In an attempt to offer something new to the learned and ongoing discussion about its relation to Saul, I'll focus on the Paul part, but try to keep sight of the doubleness through cases of other Christians with double names that include Paul. I'd like to explore how the multiple linguistic and religious backgrounds expressed in Paul, Saul, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, pagan, Jewish, Christian, resonate with the career of his Christian name in the East. I will focus on documentary sources, the papyri from Egypt, and inscriptions from further east, whose contribution to the history of this name has not yet been systematically exploited. For those interested in tracing the Christian career of Paul's name, an obvious place to start would be Elizabeth Whittycomb's standard reference work on English Christian names. And here we learn that Saul, a royal name after the predecessor of David, is found as an English Christian name from the 17th century on, and that Paul is from, I quote, Latin Paulus Small, the name of Saul of Tarsus after his conversion. Paul occurs in England before the Norman conquest only as a monk's name. It has always been commoner in Spain, Pablo, and Italy, Paolo, and Russia, Pavel, than in England, France, or Germany, end of quotation. The reasons for these national preferences seem an interesting area for further study. But as Whittycomb was concerned with the scope of Christian names in England, she omits much that would be of interest to students of early Christianity. In late antiquity and the Middle Ages in the East, Paul is much more than a monk's name or a memory of the apostles. The study of that phase of the name, besides its intrinsic interest, could answer wider questions, such as the national preferences that Whittycomb notes, for example, in Russia, whose Christianity inherited traditions of the Empire of East Rome centered at Constantinople. I mentioned a sort of sidestepping of Paul's own double name and its contemporary meaning, but that's not due to a lack of interest. I simply see more scope for intervention in the study of the sheer success of Paul as a name, just how much its inclusion as part of a double name was, for whatever reason it was chosen. Ancient reasons for name choice are not straightforward either, but we are fortunate to have some contemporary Christian accounts. Dionysius, bishop of Alexandria in the mid-3rd century, as quoted by Eusebius, considers why the name Ioannes, or John, has been so popular over the years, as well as Peter and Paul in his own day. Christians loved them, wanted to be like them, and to be loved like them. On these themes of affection and self-modeling, it is worth noting another detail recorded by Eusebius, that he himself had seen color portraits of both Paul and Peter in circulation. Eusebius does not say so, but one is tempted to see these portraits as focal points of personal devotion, even within the home, a focal point too for the devotion that would lead a parent to choose one of these apostolic names for a child. A less well-known passage for the history of Christian onomastics showcases the contribution of the papyri, a martyrdom in Coptic known only through a papyrus codex from Upper Egypt, whose hero, Saint Chamul, for whom this is nearly our only source, calls in his final prayer before martyrdom for special blessings for those who commemorate him through naming, those who give my name to their children, remembering me. Not just parents and children, the text would suggest, had an interest in the choice of a Christian name, but the holy figures stood to benefit too. Now, in East Rome, Paul never had the papal heights of Peter among the onomastics of the patriarchs of Constantinople, and the imperial name par excellence was Constantine. But Paul was widely popular, especially among monks. How it achieved that can already be glimpsed in the onomastic data from late antiquity, to which we'll return. I mention here the currency of Paul's writings as educational texts, which would have made him a familiar figure to those fortunate enough to receive an education in reading and writing, a group in turn skewed towards ecclesiastics and monks. And we can see this use of Paul already in the early Christian papyri, in which the process of learning Greek interacted with knowledge of local languages. The private archive of a flax merchant of Oxyrhynchus, active in the early 4th century, includes this copy of Romans chapter 1 for practice, in which the writer also practices using a bookhand and the scribal convention of representing sacred words with specially marked groups of letters, the so-called nomina sacra. The text, which features in the forthcoming PCE volume that Alana mentioned, is a fascinating composite of Greek and indigenous Egyptian language and documentary and literary practices of reading and writing. On the back, a Coptic docket has been added to this otherwise Greek assemblage, identifying Paul the Apostle. The distinct cursive hand at the bottom of the front suggests yet another inspiration from Paul. His name, in both the Romans passage and its docket on the back, may have invited someone to invent an Aurelius Paulus for the sake of writing practice. This codex of the early 4th century from the Lower Egyptian village of Theodelphia, also in the PCE volume, shows practice in learning the Greek and Coptic alphabets and syllabaries. The writer then moves on to copy Romans chapter 1 once again, but now in the Coptic language, and also the first chapter of the book of Job. For the persistence of memory of Paul's double name in Eastern Christianity, some further evidence comes from an unusual quarter. This is an apotropaic prayer for protection from snakes and other venomous reptiles, or healing once their bites have been experienced. It is preserved in later medieval manuscripts, but its original composition probably belongs to late antiquity. It takes as its core the narrative of Paul's shipwreck and encounter with the viper from chapter 20 of Acts, but reworks it in a first-person voice, encouraging the user of the adjuration to speak in the persona of Paul. The apostle also acknowledges his conversion and tells how an angel revealed an exorcism that would assist him and others in future attacks of the same kind. The relevance for us is that the angel addresses him as both Saul and Paul. The assonance, which may have motivated the original pairing of the two names, suits the sound effects that incantation-like texts of this kind seek out, and it also affirms the continued sense of both as constituting the apostle's proper name. But as promised, I'll return to focus on the earlier Christian name, which can inform the study of its later reception.
Is it all right if I have
This later reception is also a story of adaptation of the name outside of its original Latin and the Greek of Christian scripture.
I'm not as
I will
interested in
consider ancient parallels to this adaptation in
you out.
context in Aramaic Coptic. But that requires a background understanding of the distribution of Paul in the Roman and late ancient world. Now, a sort of counterpart of Withycombe's work for the ancient Greek world is the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names. This ongoing research project aims to organize by place and time all Greek names from Homer up to the start of the Islamic 30s CE
They always seem to get.
in a broad sense of Greek
What?
names
And how's your
and
wife?
those of other linguistic origins, like Paul, used in areas where Greek was a language of culture and governance, like the Near East and Egypt. It stops short of a prosopography, but tries to be prosopographically sensitive to avoid duplication and to set people in their proper places and times. We sometimes described it as a telephone book for the ancient Mediterranean. Established in 1972 by the historian and epigraphist Peter Fraser, the LGPN, according to an initial funding proposal submitted to the British Academy, was projected to employ a team of 2 researchers and to take no more than 10 years to complete. Now, over half a century later, the work continues, and the list of Fraser's successors as leaders of the project, Elaine Matthews, Robert Parker, Nino Luraghi, and of its contributors is in the dozens. Published volumes begin with the names of the Aegean Islands and Cyrenaica, and have now covered Attica, mainland, west, and northern Greece, and most of the extent of Greek into Europe, and more recently, Asia Minor. I had the honor of contributing to a 6th volume from 2016 to 2021 on Syria, Judea, and Palestine, and points further east, delayed for pandemic-related reasons and a complicated typesetting process, but now essentially complete. The names are collected from all available sources, but epigraphy holds a privileged place, both for the sheer masses of people inscriptions record who would otherwise have passed in silence, and for the potential witness to onomastic self-presentation. Private inscriptions, dedications, and above all, epitaphs are the most fertile epigraphic genres for onomastic data, and also the areas where individuals or their kin would have had the most control over how their names were expressed. But there are limitations. Having an epitaph at all cannot be taken as standard in the ancient world. And although the LGPN shows significantly better representation of women than one might find, say, in prosopographies based on elite historiography, they are still much underrepresented. Of the over 400,000 ancient people recorded in the volumes of LGPN prepared so far, just over 50,000 are women, around 12%. So what about Paul? For the purposes of LGPN, Paul belongs in volume 5b under his homeland of Tarsus in Cilicia, and I will focus in more detail on volume 6, Paul in the birthplace of Christianity. But before that, some statistics from the bigger picture. Outside of Judea, Palestine, and Greater Syria, we find 381 Pauls. In no area can they be said to be very common. At most, in inland Asia Minor, about 4 in every 1,000 people over the full time span of the volumes would have had that name. The highest proportions of Pauls to total persons are reached in Asia Minor, Paul's own home, and a focus of his later preaching as apostle. Considering chronology, we find no Pauls in Greek, no Pauloi before the imperial period, the Roman imperial period. The name is, after all, derived from Latin. Cognate names like Paula, Paulinus, and Paulina show a similar pattern, but none can compare to the dramatic rises in proportion for Paul into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries of some 2, 5, and 13-fold, respectively, over a 2nd century baseline. This result seems very likely due, at least in part, to the Apostle Paul himself as Christian namesake. Now, the forthcoming volume 6 of LGPN, including Syria, Palestine, Judea, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, adds 241 more Pauls. That makes 622 across all regions covered, and nearly 40% claimed by the Levant. Their presentation on the printed page will look something like this on the right side of the screen, at least for the first 121 of them. We'll take a couple of pages. The distribution is similar, of an essentially Roman name whose wider popularity coincides with Christianization between the 3rd and 5th centuries. Here are the weighted percentages of the distribution of those 241 Near Eastern Pauls up to the 6th century, showing the corresponding jump from 3rd to 4th. Now, if we consider the distribution of Pauls by region, ignoring for now the minor areas on the edge of these, which account for under 10%, we see a concentration on Judea-Palestine. It, and especially the areas of Galilee, which Jerome identifies as homeland of Paul's family, ancient Judea centered on Jerusalem, and the coastal cities of Palestine have an above-average proportion. A bias of the epigraphic record in these areas towards late antiquity, as opposed to earlier Roman times in other parts of Syria and Arabia, has to be taken into account, but the coincidence with the birthplace of Christianity remains striking. Paul also developed, in interactions with local traditions, a phenomenon to which we will return with Syriac and Coptic. The name was adapted on local onomastic patterns to form an Aramaic-style diminutive reflected in the names Paulonas, a Syrian orator mentioned by Zellmann, and Paulonios, whose epitaph survives from the Christian cemetery at Rhorer on the southern shore of the Dead Sea. I don't know of any Jewish Pauls among the people of LGPN Volume 6, but for at least one bearer of the related name Paulinus, of which the volume counts 10, allegiance to Judaism is suggested by his burial at the cemetery of Beth Shearim in the later Roman period. Of the 11,536 unique names in this volume, Paul claims 8th place in popularity, behind a mix of Greek, Latin, and Epicuric names, each of which had a Christian career of its own: Ioannes, Theodoros, Alexandros, Stephanos, Maximus, Demetrius, and Bassus, and with saintly alongside other eponyms, with importance in the history of the region. One thinks here especially of Alexander of Macedon. But in one area, Paul makes major gains over these counterparts, which takes us back to the monastic connection of his name, signaled by Withicombe. Not only were Paul's writings fundamental to Christian thought, and, as we've seen, to Christian education, but Paul's thoughts on the virtue of self-control make him an appealing patron of the ascetic way of life. Of the 616 monks recorded in LGPN Volume 6, we find 32 Pauls, nearly 52 per 1,000, second only to the 45 Johns. And if one considers the leaders of monastic communities, of which LGPN records 316 in this region, then Paul is the clear favorite, with 13/7 to John, though both are eclipsed by the 15 Theodores, 20 Stephens, and 38 Sergii. Contrast the 1,257 bishops, of which only 44 Pauls, 35 per 1,000, though they are still ranked highly, second only to the 82 Johns. So far, the career of Paul among Greek names in the geographical center of early Christianity. What about other languages in the East? The LGPN has recently taken account not only of Greek and Latin, but also of local languages in cultural contact and relevant for Hellenistic and Roman history. For Volume 6, the major contributors are the dialects of Aramaic, and for Paul as Christian name, in turn, the most relevant is Syriac. In origin, a dialect of Aramaic specific to the northern Mesopotamian city of Edessa, Syriac played a role as language of governance in the kingdom of Osrhoene, then flourished as a prestige language due to the prominence of Edessa as a Christian center. Syriac also spread both into Syria proper and throughout Mesopotamia, Persia, and as far east as India and China, thanks to literary production, especially in conjunction with Christian missionary activity. There in China, the Nestorian stele of Xi'an, erected in 781, commemorates the introduction of Christianity to China in a calligraphic text in Chinese, accompanied by dedication from clerics and missionaries in Syriac, 70 of them in all, of which even one Paul, a presbyter. Stone inscriptions in Syriac seem never to have reached the popularity of their Greek counterparts in the East, however, and the chief onomastic contribution is from literary texts, among which hagiography, chronicles, and the Acts of Church Councils claim the largest share. Despite the cultural centrality of Edessa, the distribution of the surviving evidence in fact centers on Mesopotamia. And out of all of that, we find 43 cases in which the name Paul is represented in Syriac. Some are probably translations of Greek historiographical texts or documents from church councils. Stone inscriptions may reveal more about how the name bearers or contemporaries chose to represent their names, as opposed to copyists of manuscript texts over the centuries. In one, a Paula the presbyter, is listed along with 18 others, fellow presbyters, deacons, and locals who contributed to the building of a village church in the steppes of Upper Mesopotamia in the late 6th or early 7th century. And in Berzera, in the territory of ancient Rhorer, modern Aleppo, a reused pre-Christian stone altar, itself reused in the wall of a mill, is fragmentary but preserves enough to ensure another spelling of the same loaned name, Paulos. Together, the two inscriptions illustrate two strategies for representing a foreign word: transliteration as close as possible to the lexical form, as we see in Paulos, and something perhaps closer to an inflected form in speech, Paula, which we will meet again in Egypt. So much for Paul on its own, but what about Paul as a double name? In the Near East, it turns out to be relatively rare, to say nothing of the combination with Saul. Saul itself has only one other record for LGPN in the Near East, of a relative of the Herodians and Roman ally, though the name entered Christian usage in Egypt in late antiquity. 3 cases of Pauline double names are worth a closer look. One, Paulus Maximinus, a native of Merdocha in southern Syria, contributed to building a sanctuary to the divine Master Zeus' invincible son, the god Almus, including a sacrificial altar, which was commemorated in 3 inscriptions of 320 CE. Although he and his partners in the project identify themselves as pistoi, coinciding with a Pauline epithet, the faithful, this is better taken as title of a local magistracy. His double name, for its part, explains itself most readily as a case of multiple cognomina, which arose not infrequently in later Roman times. A woman of high status in Roman Tyre dedicated a statue to her brother, whose name is lost, but who, according to the text, achieved renown and privileges in several cities of the Roman world, including Alexandria in Egypt, as she summarizes his career on the statue's base. This Claudia Paula, bearer of a Roman gentilic name that indicates her citizenship, to which Paula stood as cognomen, also had a double name, marked explicitly as an alias, Semathes, of Semitic rather than Latin or Greek origin, and hence a doublet comparable to Paul and Saul. Nothing about this lady's inscription indicates Christian identity, but as the editor of the monument, Jean-Paul Ray-Coquet, has pointed out, if one assumes that the brother's name was Paul, cognate of his sister Paula, he would have had the same name as an advocate of the Alexandrians recorded in the Acta Alexandrinorum, and a possibly identical orator from Tyre itself persuaded Hadrian to grant the city the status of a metropolis. So maybe we can say something about this family, though maybe not that they had anything to do with a firmly Christian context is that of our final example from Syriac hagiography. Here the story is one of conversion from heresy to orthodoxy, at least as the hagiographer presents it. The brother of a local magnate of Nisibis in Upper Mesopotamia is enlightened by miracles performed by a saint, Mar Augin, originally from Greek, another Greek name, Eugenios, who is the hero of the tale. The brother is introduced first under a Greek name, Kerdon. As the hagiographer explains, this name was much beloved of them because it is that of a great head of their error, even ahead of Marcion. That is, the namesake is a known Syrian Gnostic, in inverted commas, Kerdon, placed by later heresiology in the same tradition as Marcion. After baptism at the hands of the Orthodox bishop of Nisibis, the same man is Paulos, for thus the bishop named him at his baptism, and his son, whose earlier name goes unrecorded, also receives a biblical baptismal name, Ioannis in this case. Now I'd like to turn to Egypt, home of the papyri that are at the center of the research project that's hosting me here at Macquarie, and the province that allows the most detailed understanding of Egypt of early Christianity in the full historical record. To Egypt, the coverage of LGPN does not yet extend, so we rely on the names collected primarily from documentary papyri by the Belgian Trismegistos project, with the caveat that its center of focus is the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, not so much late antiquity. What this means for Paul in particular is that we must be cautious about the equations of the 1642 attestations of Paulus in Latin, Paulos in Greek, its loaned forms in Coptic, and their variants with individual people. There may be fewer of the latter than the 1365 so far indicated. The result in either case places Egypt somewhere between the West, where Paul claims on average just less than 1 person in 1,000, and the Near East, where it has nearly 6. The proportion of attestations in Egypt contributed by writings in the Coptic language is also noteworthy, nearly 25%, higher than the 18% of Paul's recorded in Syriac in the Near East. Alongside Paulos, a straightforward transliteration of the lexical form of the name, we also find Paule, which reflects an oblique case, the vocative, the form used when addressing a person directly. And it's tempting to think about a role of orality or the experience of hearing a person called by name in its transmission into Coptic. Recall Paula alongside Paulos in Syriac. This private letter on papyrus from the late 4th century shows an interesting internal variation between conventions. The opening greeting and the body are in Greek, addressing a Paulos. The closing greeting is in Coptic and addresses the same man in the vocative-derived loan form Paule. A comparison of the top 15 most frequent Greco-Roman names as loans in Coptic and Syriac complicates the picture further. Paul is in the top 5 in both, but actually more common in Syriac, where it is second only to the saintly name Sergius, whereas in Coptic it is overtaken by another apostle, Peter, and 3 saints, Victor, George, and Menas. But the papyri from Egypt offer more than statistics. The Pauls that they attest have more scope for accompanying details of lives lived, in contrast to their counterparts in the ancient world who, for us, are too often just names. A few examples will also give me a chance to highlight some of the fascinating texts that PCE will include. In one from the 3rd century, the incomparable Brother Paul is addressed in a private letter on papyrus, now in the collection of the University of Basel. He and his correspondent Arianus can be identified as Christian from the latter's closing prayer for health in the Lord, written with a nomen sacrum, As Sabina Hübner has shown, the correspondents were part of elite circles in Arsinoe, metropolis of the Arsinoite nome in Lower Egypt. Arianus is an overseer of estates, and part of the business of the letter is news of the nomination of another associate to the Boule, the town council of the same city of Arsinoe. Another brother Paulus is apparently holder of an ecclesiastical office of some elevation, if not a bishopric. He is greeted in the Lord in Pauline style, and with a nomen sacrum in this letter of recommendation on parchment of the second half of the 3rd century from Sotas, bishop of Oxyrhynchus, on behalf of 6 men with an interesting mix of Greek and Egyptian names, all said to be catechumens. They are apparently traveling on church business and should be received as is fitting, as the text has it, on their arrival. Around the end of the 3rd or the early 4th century, a 3rd Paul sends this stylish letter to a friend, drawing an extended metaphor of a mirror as sure indicator of character. It has been considered that Manichaean ideas may have influenced some doctrinal phrasing in the letter and even the mirror metaphor. But in any case, the goal of Paul is clear. He is the counterpart of the bishop Sotas, here recommending some traveling Christians, not yet catechumens, but no less worthy of his correspondent's regard and assistance. And what of Christians in Egypt who may have continued Paul's practice of the double name? The papyri offer, if I may say so, rather more interesting evidence than available from the Near East, even if they take us somewhat later. So I hope you'll bear with me. Consider Paulus alias Ornitheias, named in this documentary text of the 5th or 6th century, probably from Middle Egypt. The rare Ornitheias, for which I know of no other attestations, seems to yoke Paul to something from the personal sphere, birdman, if you will, if not a professional capacity for the bearer of this name as a poulterer or fowler, perhaps a bird-like quality about his physique. It was, after all, to physical comportment that Saulos, if considered purely as its homophone Greek adjective, would have referred. Our earliest attestation of this word is for the waddling gait of a tortoise in the Homeric hymn to Mercury. It's tempting to speculate about a connection between Paul's time at Syrian Antioch and the Cyrus Paulus on record in this accounting codex from Upper Egypt of the early 4th century. The first part of his name doubles as an ethnic epithet, the Syrian. Cash payments to him are recorded in 3 places in this codex, but unfortunately without telling us anything about what he did, let alone who he was outside of these receipts. But I've saved the most charming case for last, in my humble opinion, a 5th century cession of property, probably from Thebes. The transaction is witnessed and the instrument signed by 3 men, one with a weighty name from the Hebrew Bible, Mathusalan, from Methuselah, here son of a Ioannes, and a presbyter of the church, one Kyriakos, son of Joseph, or Yosef in its Greek form, again combining Old Testament with more recent Christian, here saintly onomastics. And finally, an Aurelius Petros, also known as Paulos, Peter alias Paul. Did this man, whose very handwriting we have before us in the last line on the screen, did he or his parents simply have trouble deciding which of the apostles they liked best? Or did they aim to maximize commemorative potential for both earthly and saintly audiences? The question is beyond answer, and the possibilities are not limited to just those, but I think it's a fitting illustration of the potential for names to inform the study of reception of Paul and his writings, and a fitting place to end, and to thank you very much for your attention.
I'm sure, like me, you're absolutely blown away by Michael's knowledge of ancient languages and the way he's put this magnificent presentation together. I've been interested in the names Paul and Peter for many years, and I've learnt more in 30 minutes from him than I have in 20 years of studying the papyri. So I'm very grateful. And you can see what a good job it is that he is at Macquarie. And I hope you'll all come and hear him on the 11th of November when he's going to present some of his findings in person. Now, opening it up to questions. Thanks. Any questions? Comments? Commendations?
Just an observation, and thank you for a terrific paper. It just jumped out at me, the extraordinary epithet for Paul in P-Baz 243, the incomparable Paul. As you know, it's a regular term for benefactors in the inscriptions, and it'd be something that Paul would totally disavow. He criticises those in 2 Corinthians 10:12 who compare themselves against each other, and then in his own self-comparison with the intruders, of course, he boasts in his weakness and humiliations. So it's fascinating how even Christians are seduced by the words of their culture, but do not understand properly how Paul disavowed them.
Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you. Yes, I think once Paul's name is out, has been released into the world, there's no control over how it's used. Indeed, thank you for that.
Question from Keith.
I'm always intrigued. We have Peter and Paul, probably two of the most important saints of the Christian world, yet they only share one day. I wonder if perhaps your work could enlighten me on that one. Maybe the rest of you know that answer already, and I'm not sure. I'm always wondering why two important people, only one saint's day.
That I'm afraid I can't answer. I think it may depend on where they're being commemorated and one could allow, especially at an earlier stage. It further complicates the question that a geographical frame of reference and a point in time will affect how and when each one is commemorated.
Just a suggestion about that. It's inherently political. It's a Western calendar construction to overcome the tension in Galatians.
Look, it's probably another way of saying the same thing, but the 29th of June, as the solemnity of Peter and Paul, is peculiarly a Western Latin festival. It's not known in the East. And also, of course, Paul does have his own festival on the 25th of January. His so-called conversion is commemorated.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I think, I mean, Peter and Paul, as the feast is commemorated in the Eastern Church, in the Greek Church, and in Corinth, it is the feast day of the village and town and city, the city of Corinth, in honor of Paul. And they just sort of throw Peter in there because he comes with the date. But the feast, the Banigiri, as it's celebrated at Corinth, at least since the 19th century, but I think earlier than that as well, is for Paul as first apostle to the city of Corinth. Yeah, and I mean, I think I talked with you before about my interest in Paul there, and we do see a bit of an increase in the inscriptions from Corinth, certainly of Paul's, both in the in the 5th and 6th century, and also later on in Byzantine times too. Yeah, but this is really fascinating. Thank you so much for the great paper.
Thank you, Amelia. Yes, I think there's something interesting going on in that area also with the construction of this octagonal building of which we've just been hearing about from Professor Wellborn. And yes, thank you.
Well, it just remains for us to thank Michael for a very thought-provoking and interesting paper. Over lunch, I'm going to ask him why Petros featured so highly in Coptic. Oh, I'm fascinated. So thank you very much. And we're looking forward to hearing more from you on the 11th of November and any other time.